As Anton Pavlovich Chekhov once said, you need to be satisfied with your present state and rejoice in the thought that things might have been much worse. Yeah, self-isolation is no fun, but here's a story for you to put things into perspective. While Chekhov was writing his short stories in Russia, my great-grandmother ruled her family with an iron fist in China, towering over the world at 5'1". She would remain to this day the greatest villain among my ancestors. She was not loved, but feared. Her own husband fled the country. That's my great-grandfather. Ran away. The official reason for this was he had to run from communists, but really, we think he was just trying to escape from his wife. Her children trembled at the mere sight of her. She never smiled. Her beautiful black hair was pulled back, twisted tightly into a hard bun, shining with perfection, unmoving, even in the wildest weather. Like most women at the time, her feet were bound. When she was just a little girl, balancing on these 3-inch golden lilies, she wobbled through the house like a wounded general, smoking a pipe in one hand and holding a whip in the other. The whip was used to thrash both her livestock and her children alike. Animals and people were both scared of her. Why? Because the slightest mistake was met with a brutal thrashing. Yeah, you woke up late? Thrashing. Stole a peanut? Thrashing. Dropped your brother on his head? Thrashing. Thrashing. Even old age did not thaw her belief that tenderness was nonsense, and people and animals must be terrorized into submission. She once told my mother, who was only 6 at the time, that after the sun went down, she would gobble up her fingers like carrots. And from that day on, my mother was convinced her grandmother was a witch. But great-grandmother was not always so undefeatable. At the beginning of her marriage, she bore only girls, creatures deemed worthless in the eyes of ancient Chinese society. After her 3rd pregnancy ended with yet another baby girl, oh, that happened to be my grandmother, hurrah! She became a thorn in her mother-in-law's flesh. Here was a failure, a good-for-nothing loser, who brought only more good-for-nothing losers into the world. The abuse began. She was screamed at, slapped, and shunned. Everywhere she went, she was known as the woman who could not give her husband a son. Great-grandmother never felt more alone in her life. Loneliness is not a lack of company, but a lack of allies. One morning, great-grandmother woke up determined to end it all. Someone once told her in her childhood that the head of a match was toxic. Eat one and you'll have a bit of a tummy ache, but swallow a pound of it down and you will surely die. Great-grandmother gathered up all the boxes of matches she could find. And she locked herself up in the kitchen. Great-grandmother put on a pair, or one apron rather. Put on her apron. And then she found a pair of scissors. And she began to cut off the heads of matches, one by one, crying silently to herself as the bits of phosphorus began to gather beneath her. So, this was life. Oh, how unfortunate it was to be a woman. Education denied. Feet bound. Endless beatings. In the next life, it's better to reincarnate as a dog than to be born a girl. Great-grandmother picked up the last match, clipped off its little head, and threw it into the heap. The little match had bounced, rolled down the pile, but somewhere along its journey, it caused just a single little spark. And then suddenly, poof! And all at once, all the match heads were consumed by a fantastic fire. Great-grandmother looked down and gasped as she saw something burning in her lap. She jumped into the air and ran out into the courtyard, screaming at the top of her lungs. Her mother-in-law dashed out and looked on in stupefied horror as great-grandmother ran past her with a burning crotch. Relatives from every corner came out with their pots and pans and doused her with water. Ah! The fire was quickly put out. A silence ensued. Then, as the family backed away from the suicider, they found her lying in the middle of the ground, staring up at the sky with a childlike wonder. Miraculously, she was not hurt. Instead, she was wet, shocked, and had a burn hole in her crotch. The fire had scorched through her apron, her trousers, her underwear, and had even taken off a handful of her pubic hair. Great-grandmother got on her feet, dusted off her bottom, and began to walk toward her room. But as she walked past her mother-in-law, she gave the woman a look hotter than the fire that just scorched her loins. See, the incident had burned away all her self-pity. And from that day on, great-grandmother would become a fascist matriarch, meeting every crime committed against her with punishment. So, you feeling lonely? Feeling isolated? Well, my friends, it could be worse. You could be feeling lonely and isolated with a burning crotch. And, as Chekhov once said, if your matches suddenly go off in your pocket, rejoice and give thanks to heavens that you don't have gunpowder in your pocket. Woo!